Hello, and welcome back to our podcast. My name is Dale Rood. In this episode, we're going to be covering part 14 of the series Unraveling the Revelation, a detailed look at the influences of the Church of God's interpretation of the book of Revelation. I mentioned this before, but I also wanted to present it in a more demonstrative way. If you have any comments, questions, or even criticisms, please feel free to contact me at respondingtoreligiousramblings@gmail.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and if you do, you will receive updates of when material is available. And as I have not really advertised this podcast yet, I'm still learning how to work the software and so forth. I've only been able to share this with some of my friends on Facebook as well as some personal friends. And so it's not really widely available at this point. But if you're with me and we're on episode number 14, it's because you're finding something interesting about it. So I would invite you to share this channel with a friend. To do so, you can use the link that I have there at the bottom of the page, or you can ask them to go to, on YouTube, Responding to Religious Ramblings with an underline between the spaces there. And more specifically, if you type in Unraveling the Revelation with Responding to Religious Ramblings, it should come up for them. But the easiest way would be to just send them a link, and they can just click on it that way. Okay, let's get into our episode. So we're showing this chart here, showed it a few times now. This is a 6 seal and 7 seal comparison. And at the top, you can see the 6 seal view, or the view that was held by Brother Warner. And again, that shows the 4 time periods: the morning time, the dark ages, the cloudy age, and the evening light. And then in the evening, in the lower part, we see the 7 seal view, which divides those same 4 periods up, but now into 7 different epochs of time. So far, we have covered 1880, 1530, and today we're going to cover 230 and then 33 AD. So these are all the 6 seal dates, or the dates that are on the 6 seal charts. Next, we're going to start covering the 7 seal dates. So let's take a look at 270. 270 was described as being the beginning of the apostasy of the church. Now, I want to remind you that for each one of these years, we're answering 5 questions. And those 5 questions are being broke down. I have an individual slide for each one of those. Sometimes they go into more than one slide. But we want to answer these 5 fundamental questions. Looking forward in prophecy, what symbols or of time is used for each year? What historical event is believed to be prophesied in the Old Testament or New Testament that was supposed to happen in that year? What happened in those particular years of any significance such that it would merit the opening of that specific church age? And then we want to look outside of just Church of God literature and see if there's any secular literature, historical literature, that also talks about that particular age or that particular church, particular date. And then in what Church of God writing do we first see those years mentioned, and who was the author? So again, we're going to be looking specifically today at AD 270, which was preceded by 33 AD, which is a span of 237 years. Now, I want to emphasize this. I've been emphasizing this all along, but I thought I would just put it in picture form. Prophecy is looking forward. It's not looking backwards. It's looking forward. when people make prophecies, when the Spirit of God would put it upon people's hearts to make prophecies, they were always about things in the future. And doing so, many times they expose the conditions of the present, and occasionally, as a background type of thing, we look into the history of what might have led up to that point. But prophecy is looking forward. So we would expect there to be some sort of beginning or starting point. And then as we progress along in the milestones, and in this particular case, I'm referring to the milestones at the top of our Revelation charts, we would expect to have some kind of information that would lead us from one point to the next. That could either be a symbol, or some kind of time symbol, or some kind of event that would predict what was going to happen next. And then ultimately we would reach the end point. So we're looking forward. That's going to be important for this particular episode. You're going to see something that you may have not picked up on before. Certainly something new to me. Okay, let's start with question number 1. Looking forward in prophecy, what symbol or symbols of time is used to reach 270 AD? Where do we find a span of 237 years from AD 33 to AD 270 believed to be prophesied in scriptures? Okay, let's take a look at that. Well, unlike any of the other dates on the chart, Brother Warner and the other Church of God writers, they don't refer to any specific symbol of time to explain how numerically we arrive at 270. So if you go back to the previous episode, you will see that there were symbols that were used to explain how those dates came about. But in 270, there's no symbol that's used or even attempted to be used to explain how we go from 33 to 270 from a time perspective. Okay, as close as we could get to that is in the Old Testament, the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel prophesied against Israel. Sometimes that's used as a type of the New Testament church, as well as the rebellion of Israel, as a coming time of apostasy. And there are people that have spent much effort to go back and talk about those events, and they're really quite interesting. I really would encourage you to look at some of those that does those kind of comparisons. And then in the New Testament, clearly an apostasy was prophesied to take place, and let's take a look at those. So let's look first at the Old Testament. Now we're answering the question, what historical event was believed to be prophesied in the New Testament or Old Testament to happen in the year 270? Okay, in Ezekiel 5, verse number 5 through 8, Ezekiel 5, verses number 11 and 12, and then also then in Ezekiel 5, verses number 16 through 17. Often these verses are used to describe an apostasy that was to take place, so in types and shadows. But none of those passages are associated with a specific symbol or timeline that gives us any indication of when that apostasy might happen. Even in the shadow, the types and shadows, or the type and the anti-type, we have no symbol there. And so we've used the Old Testament before, and we've been able to find symbols that helped us get from one point to the next. But we don't have that for 270. At least not to get there from AD 33 to 270. Okay, what about the New Testament? Well, clearly an apostasy within the church is taught. But even in that case, none of the symbols, or not none of the symbols, but none of the passages offer a specific timeline or are associated with a time symbol. So let's just look at a few of these. In Acts, the 20th chapter, verse number 29, it says, "After my departing, grievous wolves would enter among you. Now, Paul died in about AD 64. So here we just know that sometime after that, there was going to be some issues that was going to be arising. And there was going to be a departing, if you will. After his departing, there would be grievous wolves that would enter in. So that's one passage that talks about an apostasy, or at least something negative taking place. In Galatians, the 1st chapter, verse number 6, "I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you," and you're removed from, in other words, you're gone off to another gospel. Well, that's an apostasy. But here we don't have any timeline associated with that, other than to say it happened fairly quickly, fairly soon. From the time that they had received that gospel, they went off to another gospel. Okay, in 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3, it says, "In the latter times some shall depart from the faith." Okay, latter times. Just sometime later on. We don't know. We have no estimation of when that would happen. 1 Thessalonians 2:3. "For that day shall not come," speaking of the second coming of Christ, except there come a falling away first." And so here we have, I would say, almost specific mention of an apostasy or a falling away that was going to take place among the people of God. So, just by those passages in the New Testament, we don't know if that was going to be 10 years, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. We have no indication of when that was going to take place. There is no symbol or timeline associated with it. Okay, let's answer the next question. What happened in the year 270 AD that was significant enough to mark it as the beginning year of the apostasy of the church? So let me just say this, and I'll just say it straight out. There is no specific event of significance that occurred in the year 270. Let me repeat that. There is no specific event of significance that occurred in 270, and by significance, I'm talking about the opening of a new church age, a new era within the church. Okay, and we'll get to this a little bit, a couple slides from now. So, the nature of an apostasy is not something that happens in a day. You don't just wake up and say, "Well, I think I'll apostatize today." We don't do that. The church doesn't. It's never happened that way. It's a very slow process. It's a very gradual thing. And so when we try to assign a date to a process, we often will get it wrong. So let me just read this bullet as I've presented it here. The apostasy within the New Testament church was a very gradual thing that started when Scripture was being written and gradually developed into the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, to put our finger down on a specific year and say, this is the year of apostasy, I'm certain that we cannot do that. And that's really a matter of opinion. Really, it's arbitrary depending on what your perspective might be. Okay, in Revelation, Jesus found problems with 5 of the 7 churches. Now, we know that Revelation was given to John in AD 96. Well, at that time, 5 of the 7 churches had issues. They had problems. And when John went back, he got this vision. He went back and he addressed those. And so, while I don't think that's an apostasy because there are church problems necessarily, there were conditions that were already existing in those 7 churches that could lead to problems had they not been resolved. Okay? An early example of the development of a hierarchy can be found in 3 John, the 1st chapter, and verse number 9 through 11. So this is an example of an issue that was developing even in the morning time church. And in this particular case, Diophantines had assumed the preeminence of others within the church. To the point that he's like, I'm forbidding you to even having things to do with these, and I'll cast you out of the church. So he was assuming authority and trying to tell people what they could not do and who they could not do, and didn't even want them to listen to the Apostle John, or John the Apostle. I mean, he was right there with Jesus at this point. I believe he was the last apostle alive, and this man was like, I don't want you to even have anything to do with him. If you do, out you go. Well, that is a sign of apostasy. When someone thinks they have that authority over the leading of the Holy Spirit, that's an issue. Also during those days, and by the way, I do plan to bring a series of podcasts, and one of the topics I would like to discuss is church government. And in that particular series of episodes, I will be talking about the development of hierarchy within the church, and we will be addressing Diophantines in a little bit more detail. Okay, Gnosticism, that was an issue that had developed. And when John, realized there were some things happening through vision, he came back and he addressed that head on. We read about that in in 1 John, in that first letter. The lack of fervency in love. That's a sign of apostasy, a sure tell sign of apostasy, when people have lost their love for God and lost their love for each other. Jesus made it very clear. He made it very clear that the 2 greatest commandments are to love God supremely, and the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. If we do not uphold those commandments that were given to us, then we are in a state of apostasy, especially if we had been in that state at one time. So that's a condition that was very prevalent. In fact, if you just go back and do a word search on John, 1 John, look how many times he talked about love. But he knew that was the key. If that wasn't working right, then nothing was going to work right. And I'm going to throw my 2 cents worth in here. But in many circles today in the Church of God, when you even use the word love, it's automatically associated with some kind of compromise. Oh, that must be a compromiser. How sad is that? Is that not a sign of apostasy working, even in our day today? So that's my 2 cents worth in there. Again, I'm trying to keep my opinion out of this, but this particular subject is not my opinion. This is something that we can read about. We can read about what was happening in that church of Ephesus, how they had left their first love, and they were headed for trouble. Okay, so there is no specific event or date to assign to the beginning of the apostasy. That date, if someone goes to try to assign it, it's arbitrary based on a number of things, whatever reason they may be having. Okay, so let's answer the question: in what secular historical literature do we find the year 270 listed as a major milestone in church history? Okay, so I've done a search on many church history books and tried to find something there to see if there was something that happened in history that was of significance. And I've read the Church of God books. I've read the Gospel Trumpets. I've read books that individuals have produced over the years. And there's just nothing there. If you do a search on it, and please don't take anything that I say with this entire podcast. Don't take it just because I say it. I want you to do the research. You know, we have access now to information that we've never had before. You know, the World Wide Web allows us to go out and do searches of books, places, things, people, historical events that it would have taken people in the past. They would have to do a lot of traveling and to try to find these things out. Now we have it at the touch of our fingertips, and there's no excuse for us not to spend some time checking these things out. So the only thing I could find was, you know, in around 269 or 270, St. Valentine died. Is that significant to open up a new church age? I think we would all agree that the answer to that is no. There was some talk about the story of St. Nicholas in 270. That story began to emerge. And of course, we all know that led to Santa Claus and all that. And I know that within the Church of God, there are people that do not celebrate Christmas in any way, shape, or form. We have some that sort of celebrate it. We have some that celebrate it. But whatever your position might be on that, I think that the fact that they just started talking about St. Nicholas in 270, that is not something that is a major milestone in church history. Also, it was around that same time that the growth of monasteries, I had to stop and think about that for a minute. The growth of monasteries began to form. So there were men that became hermits, and they would separate themselves from the things of the world, and they would just concentrate on the things of God, and they would preserve documents and those kind of things. But once again, you know, whatever our views may be of that, that's not significant enough to say that that was the beginning of apostasy in the church. So, let's go on. Warner and others would refer to the opening of the seventh church age as about 270. So remember, Warner had 4 church ages, the age of apostasy. He would say, when he would refer to it, he would say, well, it happened in about 270. So let me give some specific examples. In the March 15th, 1887 issue of the Gospel Trumpet, we find this reference. According to prophecy, revelation, and the sign of times, the sun began to be darkened about the year 270, about the year 270, when the 1260 days began. Okay. The papacy was not set up until, this is another reference here, but the papacy was not set up until the 4th century. But the same ecclesiastical beast authority that formed into the papacy was set up about the year 270. And you can find that in the September 15th issue of the Gospel Trumpet in the year 1887. And finally, our last reference from Brother Warner is in the August 1st, 1888 issue of the Gospel Trumpet, and it says, about 270, the apostasy began. In 325, at the Nicene Council, the Bishop of Rome was made head over the whole ecclesiastic organization which had taken the place of the true church. So he was saying basically in 325, at this particular council, the Bishop of Rome was identified as being the head, and there's some discussion about that. I'm not quite sure that happened in that particular council, but that's what Brother Warner was referring to. But then he wasn't referring to that date as, the beginning of the apostasy. He said it had happened earlier, and it happened about 270. Well, again, it's hard for us to identify which year it was. I don't think you can, because things have been happening prior to even the closing of the first century. And then if you read in some of the church fathers' writings, you can clearly see that there was an apostasy had taken place. And I made reference to one of them, in other words, the development of the hierarchy. Bishops and then bishops over bishops. All that is apostasy, part of the apostasy. And our Six Hill writers made that very clear. Okay. Now we're going to get to the heart of this. Where did we really get this 270 from? In what Church of God writing do we first see it, and who was the author? The answer to that can be seen in a couple articles I'm going to share with you. The first one is March 15th of 1887. This is Brother Warner. And this is what he had to say. I'm going to read it. According to prophecy, revelation, and the signs of times, the sun began to be darkened about the year 270 when the 1260 days began, Revelation 11:3 and Revelation 13:5. And according to Ezekiel 4:6, a day for a year, it would make 1260 years. The reign of the first beast, Revelation 13:5. It is an evident fact that Roman Catholicism was the first beast, and according to history, the Pope lost his power about the year 1530. Now count back 1260 years, we have 270, making the time when the church began to go into apostasy, when the clear day was darkened and the sun went down at noon, Amos 8:9. When that man of sin was revealed, the son of perdition, 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Now, did you catch that? Brother Warner, we've already talked about 1530 and how we came to 1530. And I'll touch on that again here very shortly. So 1530 was established. It was a necessary date that we had 1530 to get us to 1880. So what he is basically saying here, he just comes out and says it. When we count back, let's count back. That's not how prophecy works. Prophecy should be taking us forward. We shouldn't be subtracting. We should be adding. And so he counted back from 1530, subtracted 1260, and he came to 270. That's how we have 270 on our chart. It's used to make the two dates later on that had already been established, it's used to justify them. Okay? So you can see that in the little diagram at the bottom there. The difference between 530, when you subtract out 1260 years, you're at 270. Okay, let's look at another one. Brother Warner did not hide the fact of how he got to 270. He made that very plain in his writings. So here we have December the 1st, 1890, of the Gospel Trumpet, and it's on page 1. Someone wrote in and they said, I wish you to give the dates you preached at St. James Camp Meeting concerning the beast in Revelation 13, and the date that Daniel's time reasoned from them. Okay, so I didn't include this particular part. You recall that we talked about the 2,330 years. So in this article, Brother Warner addresses that, and he uses the rationale that I've already presented, which has been shown to be wrong, and it was not included in standard Church of God publications. It was wrong. Why? Because Brother Warner used the wrong start date. He used the wrong commandment from Artaxias, and also he added an arbitrarily 25 years and used that as the start date from that commandment time, and that's how he was able to get to 1880. Okay, so he did explain that. I didn't include it for the space of time here, and I don't want these charts to get too busy. But you can go back. Again, let me remind you, all this information that I'm giving you, when I give you the references, which I'm trying to do for everything, you can go back and check that out for yourself. Go to the Church of God Archives section of the Nicholson Library over in Anderson, Indiana. They have an online library. It's part of the school over there. And you can read all of these gospel trumpets for yourself. You know, they've spent... I was part of the project of having those things scanned. So I went over to Anderson and I took some of the stuff from my library and other places, and we were able to find the best copy of the gospel trumpets, and they got a grant for like $700,000 from the Lillie Foundation, if my memory is correct, $700,000 to have those preserved. And then it took some more money to go from having those scanned to having those put through a process that takes a picture and turns it into text, searchable text. So these people have done a tremendous service to us that have an interest in this information. You know, well over $700,000 for both projects has been invested in getting this and making this happen. So please take advantage of that. Go there. Get those issues. You can download them for free, and you can read this. So I'm asking you to do that. Do those searches and download this information. So let's see what he had to say here, Brother Warner, as far as the camp meeting dates that he presented in a message there. Here's what he says. The Asbury Confession, the first Protestantism, was adapted and signed by the Emperor of Germany, many princes, and the Reformed ministry in A.D. 1530. That is the point of calculation between the two beasts. Counting back 1,260 years from that time covers the first beast, or Romanism, and it takes it back to A.D. 270. His beginning, for which we have striking historical proofs. Counting forward 350 years from A.D. 1530 brings us to 1880. The first beast continued 42 months, Revelation 13:5. That was Catholicism. 42 Jewish months makes 1,260 days. Each day represents a year. See Ezekiel 4:4-6, and Numbers 14:31. Immediately following the first beast comes the second, which is Protestantism. Revelation 13:11. The time of the beast is not revealed here, but in Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3, the same 42 months of the first beast is spoken of, which is also called 1,263 years. So what do we see? And I've got some more of this article I'm going to read here in the next couple slides. What do we read here? He's saying that we already know that Protestantism got started in 1530. So you can look at our last episode and see if that's correct or not. If the establishment of a Lutheran creed was the beginning of Protestantism or the beginning of that beast. We addressed that issue previously. So whenever the year 1530 was established, then he says, count back 1,260 years from 1530, and that brings you back to 270. That's called backdating. 270 is a date that is a result of backdating. It's not a date that was prophesied beforehand getting you to 270. There's nothing that we can find that gets us from 33 to 270 in terms of a prophecy of a specific time or day for a year or whatever means we might want to use. So the only way we can get there is to go backwards. And that's exactly what Brother Warner did. Furthermore, in that same article, he says this: "And this time of the first beast and the testimony of the two witnesses is immediately followed by 3 days and a half that the two witnesses lay in the streets of Sodom and Egypt." Revelation 10, 7 and 9. So it is a fact that the 3 days and a half covers the same time that the second beast does, both coming directly after 42 months, the 42 months expire. As the second beast is Protestantism, the 3 days and a half must represent the time of Protestantism because it was just 350 years from the time of the first Protestant creed was made until the purging of the church in the evening light, or, in other words, from 1530 to 1880. We know that the 3½ days of Revelation are 3½ centuries. In fact, the Spirit of God showed us and others this before we even knew the historical facts that occur. Okay, so he was basically describing here that the things that we've talked about so far, how he got to the years 270, 1530, and 1880. Let's read one more thing. He says in that same article, "History is very uniform and clear in speaking of the great epic of 1530 as the transition point from the first to the second forms of the apostasy. So it is a plain problem. Measure back 1260 years from AD 1530 and it carries us back to AD 270. And in several histories, we have clear evidence that the apostasy arose about that time. So add together 270 years of pure church, 1,260 years of Romanism to the rise of Protestantism, and then 350 years later, that gets us to the evening light, and the sum of the whole reaches us to 1880, the year that he wrote his book. So, Brother Warner did not make it, was not hiding the fact of how he got to 270. He got it through backdating. Back to that. Now he talks about in here about there's clear evidence and there's a tremendous amount of proof, but it's never cited. So if you look at his writings, you try to find the event of 270, it's almost always discussed in terms of just prophecy and calculations rather than events that took place. Okay, and that's pretty much true of most of the Church of God writings that I've seen. Now, I started this out by saying if you've got comments or you've got further information, please, by all means, send that to me. I would love to see it. I've searched and searched and searched. I've explained to you this is my journey here. I'm sharing it with you, and this is where I'm at. I've reached the conclusion, based on all the evidence, that 270 is not a significant year in church history, but it's a result of backdating from 1880 back to 1530 and back to 270, and then presenting it in a forward way that makes it sound like you're arriving at 1880. So, I shared this earlier. What should we be doing? We should be going forward in prophecy. But here's what happened. Brother Warner started in 1880. He started at the end of the prophecy. when he published his book, and with his understanding that the evening light era began. That's when he was first starting about talking about coming out and sectism and so forth. At that time, he was still in a sect himself, but he was beginning to see the understanding of the evils of sectism. And he began talking about the evening light era in 1880. He started from there, and then he backdated to get us back to 1530, used the Augsburg Confession as the event in 1530 that began Protestantism, rather than Martin Luther's nailing his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg, which most scholars, in fact about all scholars, attribute that as the beginning of the Protestantism. But he used 1530 because why? It happened in 1530. He used the Augsburg Confession because it happened in 1530. That matched up with the timeline to get us to 1880. Then he went from 1530 and he subtracted out, or as he said, dating back, he got back to 270. And he used what symbols? Well, we talked about this last time. He used the 42 months and the times and a half to get back to 270. But no event is ever actually documented that I could find that says this happened in this year, 270. You won't find it. I don't think you'll find it. And why do I not think you'll find it? Because apostasy doesn't happen in a year. You can't trace it down to a year. It's a process. It's a very gradual process. So then getting us from 33 looking forward to 270, we have no time symbol. There's no time symbol ever even attempted to be used to explain that span of 237 years. So everything started at the tail end of this and went backwards. And then ultimately the beginning point was AD 33, the beginning of the church. So this kind of shows, with all the details taken out, this kind of shows the process of Warner's timeline. Start at the far end of the right hand side, start your starting point out at the end, work your way back through the milestones, and then arrive back at the ending point. That's how he did it. So it's the opposite way that it should be. Okay, so why do you think this happened? Why do we think this happened? Why do I think it happened? I have racked my brain. I have looked at all the evidence that's out there. And I tell you, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Brother Warner. I don't know too many people that have invested time and resources in trying to learn more and purchasing these original sources. I'm not saying this to boast in any way, but my interest, I have a tremendous amount of interest in these things, in Church of God literature. I may have the largest privately owned library of Church of God literature. And again, I don't say that to boast. I'm thankful that I was able to have the resources to be able to put together a library like that. And by the way, I invite you to come over to my house. If you're interested in coming over seeing those things, contact me through the email. We can talk on the telephone. I don't put my telephone number on social media because I get so many spam calls as it is now, that I don't want my phone number out there and a bunch of spammers give me a call. So I don't put it out there. But I will give it to you if you email me. If you have an interest in coming over and seeing my library, please, you're welcome to. We'll have a good time. I'll probably even take you out to dinner. So I thought, in my library, you're going to find a picture of Brother Warner. I put it right out there. I have a lot of the Six Seal brothers, pictures of them, with quotes that they said. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. nothing that I've said in any of these podcasts should be taken in a derogatory way towards him. I have, again, I'll repeat it, but I have respect for him. I have respect for the way God used him. It's undeniable. God used him, and he was very zealous, and God saw that, and God honored that in his consecration and everything. And so I'm thankful for him. So what happened, though? What are some of the potential reasons for the conclusions that were reached that we've shown did not come to pass, or that the wrong years were used? Well, part of it could have been that his personal experience with previous church affiliations. We know he was part of a breakaway group with the Winebrenner Church. We know that he was part of the National Holiest Association and kind of put out of that because he wouldn't be a member of a denomination or a sect. They expelled him from the Winebrenner Church because he wouldn't live up to their expectations. So he had some bad experiences, and so when this message of freedom came to him, he had all this bad personal experience that might have influenced him in some way, in his thinking at least. If you're in a bad way, and then all of a sudden you're brought into a good environment, sometimes that our past can influence the way that we think. It's just a natural thing. It can happen to any of us. Sadly, I know people that, because of their past experiences, they might have come away from a religious group or even the Church of God, and some of them become atheists. That's horrible. So our past can influence our way of thinking, our present way of thinking. It certainly was true that he was influenced by the Adventist teaching. We have direct evidence of that. And so by using their methods and maybe their overall approach, the way that they did their calculations, the way they did their symbols, that could have affected him to the point where he believed their process, but he used his own methods to arrive at the dates that he believed in. It could be in his religious zeal and his fervor for truth. Sometimes there's people that get so zealous that they go into error because of that zeal. I'm sure you've seen it happen before. I have too. Sometimes I've talked to people and they were just so whacked out on things. It's like, wait, hold on here. I appreciate your zeal, but that's not the way this is. I could cite a lot of examples there, but nonetheless, we could all be affected that way. His sense of urgency, he believed that Jesus was coming back soon, even before he died. And so, he spent a lot of time traveling, holding meetings. That sense of urgency could have affected the way he thought about things. Christ was coming back soon, and therefore these dates just kind of lined up. They made sense because they led to 1880. And that was the end of things. This was the last Reformation that was going to take place. And sometimes you can read things into unintentionally, but read things into Scripture that's not really there. He could have an overreaction. We talked about the pendulum effect, that people have a tendency sometimes to come out and then they swing too far the other way. And it takes a while before they kind of get into the middle. Again, something that can happen to every single one of us. He also didn't have access to the original resources like we do today. If he wanted to get a book, it wasn't necessarily right there available to him. He might have to travel or whatever to find a particular book. Today, we can go to the local library, and I don't know if you know about the exchange program. You can ask to have books that are available in other libraries, and your local library can get those books from another library and loan them to you for a certain amount of time, and then they give them back eventually to the original library. So we can do that now. That's a great program. Take advantage of. I've done it before. It's wonderful. So we have there's no excuse for us not to look at original sources. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes effort. But it's worth it in the end. If we really are pursuing truth, and we're looking at things, historical events and the things that we've been discussing, we can get that information, and much of it is available on the internet. Brother Warner had a concern for souls. The thoughts of people being trapped in Babylon, which he viewed as being, all religious false systems. He still loved the people. He had a concern for them. And so, that can affect people's thinking. And Brother Warner described himself as a radical person, and described the paper as being radical. The Gospel Trumpet, it said on the front, a definite radical anti-sectarian paper. So he was a radical. And he was radical in his pursuit of truth. And sometimes when people are radical, they can come up with ideas that are radical. And so I'm just offering those as I was trying to reason in my mind how he could have reached some of these conclusions and why he, was able to go and do this backdating and come up with these dates. See, when you hear this story and it's taught in a forward manner, I spent my whole life in Church of God, in an environment that the revelation was just, it's part of our DNA. We would have weeks-long meetings, as I said early on. But when it's presented in a forward way and someone stands up there and they talk about, well, Jesus, AD 30s when Jesus was died, buried and was resurrected, and the Spirit of God was poured out on the day of Pentecost, and the church went into apostasy, and then around 270, the church was, into apostasy, and then we get to, and they just go down the list. When they present it that way, most of us will be like, oh, yeah, okay, oh, yeah, oh, yes, that makes sense, And we have confidence in the people that tell us these things. We know they're godly people. These are our leaders. And so we just accept it without even giving a whole lot of thought to it. I'm guilty of that. I did the same thing. And so when it's presented in a forward way, you almost feel like, oh, okay, yeah, I see how we get from point A to point B to point C to point D. It appears as though we're going in a prophetic way and advancing. But when we dig into it and we find that originally it wasn't that way, it was the backdating to come to those dates. And then when you realize that, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see why Brother so-and-so would say it was about, 270, it was about 1530, or about, we're going to get 7 seal dates, about 1730 and about 530. And, we see those dates being a little more, some openness to them. But that's not how it has been early on. These dates were presented, specifically. We had to have 1530, because 1530 plus 350 got us to 1880. 1880 was the start of this thing. It had to be 1530. It had to be 1880. And then for 1530, it had to go back 1260 years to get us to 270. So they were presented as though they were big events in history. And that's just not the case. Okay. So I said we were going to talk about the dates. This last one, this is an easy one. AD 33. Easy. Bam. There we go. What happened? Well, this one's not in dispute. Thank God. Jesus really did come. He died for our sins. He was buried. He was raised again so that we could be raised in newness of life. And thank God, the Spirit of God was made available to all men on the day of Pentecost. This was the first spiritual earthquake. Those are just facts. That's what this is all about. This is the message of the gospel. And we have prophecies in the Old Testament, numerous prophecies about Christ. We have Daniel 70 weeks that tells us just what year this was going to happen. We have numerous prophecies about things that were going to happen in Christ's life. Just loads and loads of event stuff, loads of timeline things. It's a fact, and it's written in a lot of secular books, things like books like Historian Josephus tells the story. There's a lot of evidence, historical evidence, outside of the Bible even, that tells us about Jesus. So I'm not even going to say more about that because there's really nothing else to be said. That's our whole life. That's the story of the gospel. And it's not really in dispute. Okay, with that, I'll close with this slide again. So again, here's my email address. Please subscribe to this channel. Asking you to do that. Send me any comments, questions, criticism. If you feel like I've got this wrong somewhere, please send me in your thoughts. Send me in what evidence that you may have along these lines, what scripture proof, what historical evidence. I would love to have discussions about this. So that's what I had to share.